And suddenly I saw those tasty cakes and pastries, and all my concerns about getting home as quickly as possible vanished into thin air. Soon all of us were sitting on a small bench in one of the adjacent rooms with mouths over mouths full of sugary biscuits and cinnamon rolls, only occasionally stopping to take a sip of our hot chocolate. Mr. and Mrs. Zweifel asked us the expected barricade of questions: who we were and how we liked it in Mitchell so far. We'd been idly chatting for about 15 minutes as I remembered our peculiar objective that we'd come here to fulfill in the first place, to further work off our list of suspects. Both of you have trouble walking, right? I observed suddenly. Kai and Louise instantly ended their previous conversations about whether they would return to Mitchell for the next holidays. They noticed that I had gone back to playing detective and went to listen eagerly. "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Zweifel, who jumped at the conversation topic. I'd already noticed that older people were always happy if they had someone to listen to them talk about their various diseases and handicaps. "I've got a bad hip that should have gotten surgery a long time ago, and my husband has two bad knees." Mr. Zweifel nodded in affirmation and then added, "We avoid going outside as much as possible during this time of the year, especially if it snows as heavily as it did over the past weeks. We're both too unsteady on our legs." They limped back into the small kitchen to bring new pastry because Kai, in the meantime, had already devoured everything on the table. Still chewing, he pulled a list of suspects from his pant pockets. He shot us a quick look after he'd unfolded the paper. The two of us, Louisa and I, nodded. It was pretty obvious we could cross off the Zweifels from our list, something that we'd already considered at the front door. "They might know something about their neighbors," Louisa whispered and pointed at the name Angler. "Try ask about them." The elderly couple returned to the small room we were sitting in, both of them holding a plate piled high with pastries. Kai had folded our list back together with lightning speed and now grabbed a piece of pastry from both plates, shoving a drop cake and a donut into his mouth at the same time. I shook my head in disbelief in the face of this much appetite and then asked, "Have you heard of your neighbors recently, the Anglers?" "Huh?" Mrs. Zweifel was visibly surprised. "You know a lot about your neighbors, don't you?" I waved her off and said, "Oh no, Janine just told me a thing or two when I told her that I wanted to know who else other than us lived around this part of Mitchell." "Yes, the Anglers," called Mr. Zweifel. "They are not doing well, both of them. They've been hospitalized for the past 2 weeks. She might have pneumonia, and he suffers from shingles. I'm guessing that they won't be back until after Christmas." The three of us looked at each other, suddenly in high spirits, not because the poor old Anglers were stuck in the hospital over Christmas, but because we could cross another suspect off our list. "And Mr. Pfadbaum, what about him?" I asked. "How do you know about that guy?" Mrs. Zweifel was surprised once more. "Oh, Janine told me about him too, and I'm good at remembering names because I like reading and listening to stories." "Mr. Pfadbaum," Mr. Zweifel said, swaying thoughtfully. "He is a strange man, and most of us think that he's had a very troubled past. There's been a few dark rumors over the past years that he offended his own children, though I don't think you should pay much attention to malicious gossip like that. But he definitely seems like the type of guy who has a gaggle of misbegotten children all around the world that he doesn't take care of. But even that could just be a couple strange rumors. In reality, we barely know anything at all about him. We don't even know his first name. He came to Mitchell many years ago and hasn't really spoken to anyone here. He bought this abandoned little shack at the top of the mountainside, but hasn't really done anything about it other than living there. It's just as broken as it was when he moved in, if not more. There's a patch of garden, a garage, and well, the house itself, and it's all surrounded by scrubs and a thicket of pine trees. I am pretty sure that he doesn't even have electricity, no friends, and gets in a lot of trouble, or at least that's what everyone assumed. We never found any proof. A lot of folks round here are downright scared of him. Why that? Asked Kai with reverence written all over his face. All of us were suddenly very curious about this outlandish individual. I was quite used to people who didn't quite fit into the established pattern of normal. After all, I knew my dad, but this Mr. Pfadbaum seemed to be just another tad stranger, especially since my dad was completely harmless and no one had probably ever even thought of being scared of him. Well, some people are scared of him, started Mr. Zweifel, because he owns a homemade crossbow, and because he, according to a bunch of children, threatened to shoot them on the schoolyard, just because they'd accidentally kicked a ball against his door. The police visited him a couple times for various reasons, but they never managed to charge him of anything. Chapter 14, in which we finally have a main suspect. We looked at each other and mentally drew a line not over, but underneath the name Pfadbaum. Right now, he was the main suspect in our case, something we obviously needed to discuss right now without the Zweifels, no matter how friendly they were. Thank you, but we really need to go now, I said, or else my dad's going to start worrying about us. That was something the two elderly people understood all too well and thus made no further attempts to get us to stay. They packaged the leftover pastries into a firm little cardboard box and even wrapped a piece of string around it to make it easier to carry. Take care, warned the concerned Mr. Zweifel. The way down the creek looks like it's just powdered snow, but the entire way is iced over. Watch out and make sure you don't slip. Don't worry about us, I said a little prematurely, confident that we'd be fine anyway. After all, we had perfectly functioning knees and hips. As we got closer to the Mitchell, we started joking around and throwing our box of pastries from one person to the other. Kai, who walked last, just wanted to catch it after I'd thrown it behind me without looking. He had to have made a careless step forward and slipped onto the snow-covered ice. He slid down the steep path and took Louise and me down with him into the deep snow. For just a second, all of us were covered in snow and had to dig our way back to the surface. Exhausted and gasping for breath, we'd gone back to being little icicles ourselves and were in dire need of another mug of hot chocolate. Kai took upon himself the task to search the snow for our box of pastries, despite being cold himself. After a minute, he triumphantly held the box that luckily hadn't suffered any damage.